Hello. This past Sunday, we introduced and encountered the concept of a rule of life. And, just to summarize it, a rule of life is basically this group of rhythms and practices that we incorporate in our daily schedule that hopefully help us organize our lives around the presence of God. The Anglican priest, Margaret Gunther, calls it a spiritual budget. And if you think about it, this idea has kind of like become popular in the business world and the productivity world. Every time you read an interview about like the CEO of some tech startup about their morning routine, you're basically reading about a rule of life of sorts. The difference when we talk about a rule of life in the context of church is that it's a rule of life not only designed to make us more productive or to help us have more energy during the day, but to organize our lives around the presence of God, to help us experience the presence of God in all of the different aspects of our life. Like the idea actually of a rule of life, it doesn't start in the productivity world or the business world. It actually starts in the monasteries at the beginning of the Middle Ages. To give you a little bit of background, at that time, the church was becoming more and more influential and more powerful and popular. And unfortunately, that meant that it was also becoming more and more worldly and sometimes more and more corrupt. So a movement started with, certain men of God, priests and whatnot at the time. They decided that they didn't want to live under those conditions. And they start kind of like getting together and starting these communities where they will be living intentionally with one another, trying to foster a different type of spirit where they were living in connection with God at all times. And the governing document that they were using for that was a rule of life. And it was basically this very detailed, set of instructions of how they were going to spend their day, at what time they were going to wake up, at what time they were going to pray, what psalms they were going to read, how they, when they were going to eat, how they were going to spend their time working, also like how they were going to deal with the world outside of their monastery, but also how they were going to connect with one another. Some rules of life were very, very specific. Some were a little bit more general, but that was the general idea. Like a rule of life helped this community kind of like, form and organize around the presence of God. When you hear the word rule, actually it's not necessarily talking about rules. It actually comes from the Latin word regula, which is the word that we use for ruler. And the idea was that it was a piece of wood that you would use for like a vine to grow around. It's like a trellis. So the idea of a rule of life is not just like a list of rules that, we have to keep. It's more like, a set of practices and rhythms that actually help form our lives and help our lives flourish spiritually around the presence of God. That's what gives it its power. And in the last few decades, this concept of a rule of life has gained more and more popularity among Christians. I think particularly because we live in an age where, we're surrounded by so much stimuli and so many distractions that we have to be extra intentional in order to organize our lives around the presence of God. And, a rule of life can be a great tool to help us with that. So, how do we make a rule of life? Where do we even start? And the thing that we talked about on Sunday was that, there's two main dimensions in which we live our lives. Those are the dimensions of space and the dimension of time. And a rule of life will kind of like speak into those dimensions. When I talk about a space, what are we talking about? Well, what we do with our bodies, with our physical existence. Like, where do you find God when you're interacting with the world materially? Where do you pray? How do you connect with your community? Why it matters to attend church? Like all of those things are really about orienting your space, your physical body around the presence of God. And the other thing is how we spend our time, like how our schedule is organized and determined and making space for God in our schedule and in our time. It's like those two elements are how we can start thinking about a rule of life. So as a starting point, I would say this. In order to create a rule of life, we have to identify, the practices are helpful for you to make that area of your life center around the presence of God. So you're going to have stuff like, spiritual practices and taking time, hopefully every day to pray, and to meditate and spend time in silence seeking God and reading the scriptures, and maybe taking time weekly or monthly to fast and to take an intentional time to connect to God with your body in this way. But I also think that it includes other things like how we connect with God, in the rest of our embodied experience. Exercising can be a part of a rule of life. Having a date night can be a part of a rule of life. Trying to say that I'm going to be home from work at a certain hour. Well, it's pretty easy. But, all of those things are important because it all matters to God. So I tell people, start with this leading question. How can I organize my time and my schedule so that I can become aware of God's presence the most, but also show God's love the most to those around me? And when you start asking those questions, you can ask those questions about every single aspect of your life. So it's, your interactions with God, like your spiritual practices, but it's also your interactions with your family. Like, how are you making time to show love to your spouse? How making time to show love to your children, to your parents or your siblings or, your close friends. Maybe it's, making sure that I'm going to try to text a friend at least once a week and be in touch with them. How do I take care of my body? Like, when you start asking those questions about every aspect of your life, you're going to start saying, okay, there are practices I can incorporate here that are going to help me become aware of God's presence and center these areas of my life, whether it's my body or whether it's my family or my friendships or my budget, around God and His presence and His mission. And so what we did on Sunday is that we wanted to kind of give you a head start of what would that even look like? And we came up with a few things, just 6 things that can be like a basic rule of life that we're offering to the Encounter community as a starting point. So number 1 is start your day by seeking God. And seeking God here, we mean 2 things at least specifically: praying and reading the scriptures. Probably a good idea is before you engage anything digital, whether that's social media or the news or email, start off your day by dedicating the first minutes of your walking time to just seeking God, and spend some time in quiet and pray and read a portion of the scriptures. Maybe read a psalm or a verse of the day, or use a Bible reading plan, but do something. And if you were to dedicate a few minutes, maybe just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, just a few minutes every day to do that, you'll notice a profound difference in how you live the rest of your day. Another idea is give God thanks for at least one thing every day. Okay, and that might sound like a little bit silly, but there's a number of studies that will show that that there is a direct correlation between people that are grateful for things and people that experience higher levels of satisfaction and happiness. And you may think, of course, well, like if you're happy or thankful for things, no, but it's the opposite. It's people that practice gratitude are people that then, because they practice gratitude, they're able to experience happiness and joy. And if we believe that God is the one who gives us everything, that every good and perfect gift comes from God, then one of the things that we can do is try to make a point of thanking God for something, at least one thing, hopefully a different thing every day that He's been doing in our lives. It might be something simple like, hey, God, I want to thank you for preserving my health during this time. Or I want to thank you for my family. I want to thank you for my spouse or for my children. Maybe it can be something, hey, I want to thank you for how I've seen you speak to me during this time, or for the friends that I have. And if you start your day off by picking something different every day to thank God for, you go out of your bedroom or your house if you're commuting to work with a different perspective of life, because now you see yourself as a recipient of grace. You've experienced something good that God's done in your life. And then what happens is our mind and our spirit just awaken to the reality of God's constant goodness. The next thing is engage in some exercise at least a few times a week, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And you might say, well, what does exercise have to do with the presence of God? Well, all sorts of things. For example, it helps with energy levels. So if we want to spend more time, if you're anything like me, sometimes I wake up in the morning and I'm exhausted. And the last thing in my mind that I want to do is pray because I'm exhausted. Well, the more we exercise, the more energy we feel, the more good sleep that we can get, the less exhausted sometimes that we wake up. And it's also this idea that God has created us as embodied beings, that this body that we have is a gift from God. And part of how we connect with that, part of how we make ourselves aware of God is by taking care of our bodies. The other thing is have some sort of relational touch point. And what we mean by that is that, the temptation during this time is to retreat from relationships. Because most of our normal means of socialization are not available. If you used to connect with friends over a poker game, well, now you're not really doing that. If you like to, meet friends at a bar after work, we can't do that right now. So a lot of us, we've backed off from socializing and from community because we don't have ways in which to experience that community. And the problem is that one of the ways in which we connect with God and God connects with us is through other people. So socialization, connection, relationships, they're good for our souls. And when we say, hey, I'm going to make a point every week to try to connect with somebody, it might be something as simple as sending a text message, checking on a friend, or a message on social media. It can be something as, antiquated as making a phone call, picking up a phone and making a phone call and talking to somebody. Maybe it's calling somebody on FaceTime or having a Zoom chat with friends. But doing something every week, trying to say, I am going to not be isolated this week, but I'm going to try to connect with other people. And that can be so important for our well-being. The other thing I would say is try to make a point to engage with your encounter community. Because there's relational touch points like our family or friends, but, God is particularly present in the church through his people. And God wants to speak to you and connect with you through the people of God. And maybe, part of the isolation sometimes that maybe we feel from God is perhaps because we're not connecting with God's people. And part of what we want to, as a church, create more opportunities for us to connect is because we believe that God speaks to us and connects to us through that. So what would it look like in your life to connect with your encounter community? That might be, going on the chat on Sunday mornings when the service airs. It might be joining a life group and making sure that you're a part of a group that's connecting weekly. Maybe, being part of our Facebook page and commenting and interacting with people. Maybe texting somebody from the church and reaching out to them. But making it a point to experience a community of the church is part of the ways in which we center our lives around God's presence. The final thing I would say is, keeping the Sabbath and worshiping on Sundays. We've talked about this idea of the Sabbath, right? Okay. Creating a routine where it's a day that we're resting. We're not working, but actually just enjoying the life that God has given us and connecting with God. And then the other thing connected to that is experiencing worship, even if it's only digital right now. I know that it's not the same. I don't think that online church can ever really replace the embodied dimension of church life, but it's better than nothing. And right now we're in a situation where we have to, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That because it's not the most ideal situation that we just shove it under the rug and forget about it, that even through a computer screen, God can speak to us. So what would it look like if you make it a point every week, I'm going to take a time to worship God, even if that means tuning in online to the worship service? And these are very basic, simple 6 practices, but there's something that happens that if we were to just commit to these 6 things for a month, I think that we would notice a difference. And I think that we would start feeling and sensing and being awakened to the reality of God's presence in our lives. To close up, I want to say a couple things. One is that, there's really not a rule of life in the Bible. So I want to sound legalistic about this. This is a tool, and I think it'll be very helpful. But it might not work out for you for a number of reasons, and that's okay. But don't knock it off until you try it and see if God does something in you. The other thing is a rule of life, develops out of the context of our own lives and what our lives look like. And it varies from person to person, and that's okay. So maybe take this template and use it as a starting point, and feel free to maybe take things off or modify things or add things to what works for your life, because God wants to meet you there in the reality of your life. And to close, think about this idea. Think about the rule of life not just as a list of regulations or rules that you have to follow, but think about it as this tool that God wants to give you to help your spiritual life flourish. God wants to make it easier for us to pray. God wants to make it easier for us to read the scriptures. God wants to make it easier for us to live in community. And maybe this is a tool that God can use for that. If it's making a commitment of saying, I am going to be intentional about my relationship with God. I'm going to be intentional about my relationship with my family. I'm going to be intentional about my relationship with my friends. And what if we try this and we see God move? So I hope that this gives you a good idea of how to start. We have this rule of life on a blog post in a section on our website that you can check out and read, copy it, modify it, and I hope that it helps you in your journey to encounter God and to organize your life around God's presence.